Anthony first heard it in the trees before he ever saw it. It was sometime after midnight. The sky over the central highlands pressed low and heavy, a lid of humid darkness. The jungle around them was a single breathing thing. Cicadas rattling like broken glass, frogs chirping in clogged ditches, something unseen crashing far off with the lazy force of falling fruit. The air smelled of wet earth, rot, and the ghost of last week's artillery. Anthony lay in the shallow depression they were calling a foxhole, his rifle across his chest, sweat running down his temples into his ears, listening to Sergeant Keller's quiet, steady breathing a few feet away. 5 of them in all spread out in a loose circle at the edge of the tree line. Anthony, Keller, Mason, Doc Harris, and Tran. They were just another fire team in just another nameless piece of jungle, a place that didn't show on any map and officially didn't exist. In the logbook back at base, the entry for their mission simply read, Recon Valley 47B 4 days. Report VC movement. Valley 47B was a place no one wanted to be. The local ARVN scouts had refused to go. One of them, an older man with gray in his hair and deep lines in his face, had shaken his head so hard his cap nearly fell off. He'd spoken quickly in Vietnamese to Tran, eyes wide, and then stepped back from the jeep like it was cursed. What's he saying? Keller had asked, chewing on a matchstick, watching the man warily. Tran had seemed uncomfortable. He says the valley is bad. Spirits, people disappear there. It is an old village ground. They say something lives in the trees. Charlie lives in the trees, Mason had snorted. We know. Tran had looked at the ground instead of at Mason. He says not Viet Cong, something else. They'd all laughed because it was easier than admitting the shiver that ran along their spines. Even then, before the first night, before the radios started acting up and the jungle began whispering in voices that didn't belong, something about that valley had felt wrong, like a room where someone had just been arguing and gone quiet when you walked in. Now, lying in the shallow dirt, staring up at the sliver of sky between the leaves, Anthony heard it for the first time. A sound that didn't fit with the rest of the jungle. At first, he thought it was just wind in the canopy. A slow, heavy shifting, like a big branch flexing under a weight. But the air was still. The leaves weren't rustling, the damp hanging like a curtain. The noise came again, 2 slow, deliberate cracks, as if something large was moving its weight from one foot to another on hidden wood. Anthony's fingers tightened on the stock of his rifle. He listened harder, his heartbeat starting to climb. The ordinary jungle sounds seemed to pull back, like they too were listening. Keller, he whispered, barely audible. You hear that? No answer. The sergeant might be dozing, though he was the kind of man who claimed he never truly slept in the bush. Anthony swallowed and kept listening. Crack, creak, not close but not far, maybe 50 yards out in the trees. Too slow and heavy for a monkey, too uneven for a falling branch. Every hair on Anthony's arm stood up. Something was walking out there. He pressed his cheek harder into the damp earth, trying to get his eyes under the lowest layer of brush. But there was nothing to see except blackness between trunks, layers of shadow like curtains drawn one over another. His mind started conjuring shapes anyway. A tall outline between 2 trees, a pale flash of something like skin, eyes glinting. Probably a damn water buffalo, he muttered under his breath, trying to talk himself down. But water buffalo didn't walk on 2 feet. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. No fading steps, no retreating rustle, just stopped. The jungle filled the silence again, loud and almost relieved. Anthony waited. 1 minute. 2, 10. His heartbeat returned to normal and the details of the moment began to blur. Maybe he'd imagined it. Out here, tired and strung tight, your brain started filling in the gaps, making ghosts out of shadows. He'd heard stories about guys losing it in the bush, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices in the trees. He tried to push it away, focus on his breathing. In, out, in, out. Somewhere to his right, Mason shifted and muttered in his sleep. A mosquito whined in Anthony's ear and he flicked it away. Time slid past in sticky, uncomfortable inches. By dawn, he'd almost convinced himself he'd made the whole thing up. They moved out at first light, a thin gray seeping through the canopy, turning the jungle from black to camouflage. Keller led, as always, map case tied down with a rubber band, eyes scanning. The valley floor stretched out ahead, a gently sloping channel clogged with bamboo and ferns, flanked by dark ridges like sleeping beasts. "Stay tight," Keller said. "Eyes open. Tran, keep us honest on the trail." Tran nodded once. He moved quietly, almost like he belonged there. The others did not. Mason grumbled under his breath. Doc Harris yawned around the cigarette he shouldn't have been smoking. Anthony walked second from last, his boots sinking into the soft, wet ground, his shoulders already aching under the weight of his pack. By mid-morning, it started again. They were passing through a slightly more open area, where the trees thinned and the light made it all the way to the jungle floor in gray-green shafts. The air smelled of something sour, like old smoke and wet ash. Tran slowed, crouching to examine the ground. "What is it?" Keller asked. Tran pointed to a patch of disturbed earth. "Maybe old fire, maybe village here long time ago." Anthony saw it too now. A circle of stones half buried in vines, the ghost of a fire pit. Nearby, something that might once have been a hut post rotted down to a jagged stump. "Any sign of recent activity?" Keller asked. Tran shook his head. "No boot prints. No fresh ash, old." "Mark it," Keller said, more out of habit than belief that anyone back at base cared about some forgotten village. "We'll move on. Stay sharp." They started forward again, and that's when it came. A heavy, deliberate crack from somewhere in the trees to their left. Then another, each one spaced out like the footsteps of something enormous. Anthony's stomach turned to ice. That was it. The exact same sound from the night before. Not wind. Not a buffalo. It was walking with them. Keller's hand shot up, a clenched fist. Everyone froze, sinking into the undergrowth, rifles swinging toward the sound. Anthony dropped to one knee, trying to see through the dense mess of ferns and roots and lianas. His mouth was dry. The footsteps continued, crack, 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 slow, measured, as if whatever it was knew they were there and didn't care if they heard it, as if it wanted them to. Mason's breathing grew loud in the silence. Doc Harris's lips moved soundlessly, counting the intervals. "Tran," Keller whispered, "talk to me, animal." Tran's face was tight, eyes searching the tree line. He mouthed, "Kong by it, asterisk, asterisk, I don't know." The sound stopped again. For a long moment, nobody moved. Anthony could feel sweat running down the sides of his ribs, the weight of his helmet pressing into his forehead. The jungle waited with them, full of watching insects and birds and things with no names in English. Then slowly, Keller lowered his fist. "Nothing moves, nothing shoots unless you see something that breathes and carries a rifle," he said quietly. "Stay focused. We've got a job." They kept walking, but the mood had changed. Before, the danger felt distant, an unseen sniper, a buried mine. Now it felt close and personal, walking right beside them in the shade, just out of sight. Every snapped twig made them jump. Every shadow looked a little too tall. By noon, the valley narrowed, the jungle squeezing in on both sides. The map said there should be a stream ahead where they could refill canteens. Water always meant risk. Trails, ambush points, leeches thick enough to squirm between your toes. But it also meant they could stop pretending the warm, metallic taste of their nearly empty canteens was enough. "Another 100 meters, Keller said quietly. "Tran, confirm." Tran tilted his head, listening like the trees were whispering directions. Then he nodded toward an opening between two mossy boulders. "I hear water that way." They pushed through a curtain of vines and stepped into a thin, gray-lit clearing, where a narrow stream crawled over smooth stones. The air was cooler here. The sound of water made everyone relax just a little. "Set perimeter," Keller ordered. "Fast, 2 minutes." Mason and Anthony took positions on opposite sides of the clearing, watching the trees while Doc and Tran filled canteens. Keller squatted near the stream, splashing water onto his face. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. Just another patrol in just another part of Vietnam, scared but manageable. Then Anthony saw the footprints. They were in the mud near the far bank, just beyond Tran's boots. At first he thought they were just some distortion in the wet earth, random shapes. But as his eyes adjusted, the pattern resolved. Impressions sunk deep into the mud, spaced like steps. Whatever had made them had walked along the stream. Recently, the edges were still sharp, not yet softened by runoff. "Tran," Anthony called softly. "Keller, over here." They came one by one, squatting beside him. Doc Harris, canteen forgotten, whistled under his breath. "Christ," he murmured. The footprints were long, too long. Each one looked roughly human-shaped, heel, ball, the faint suggestion of toes, but stretched out like someone had grabbed a normal boot print and pulled it longer. They were also far apart, each step nearly twice the length of Anthony's stride. "Could be a trick of the mud," Mason offered weakly. "Water distorts stuff, right?" Keller didn't answer immediately. His jaw twitched. He glanced at Tran. "VC, different boots." Tran shook his head slowly, eyes wide. No Viet Cong shoe like this, no boot like this." He hesitated, then added, "No human like this." The last sentence hung in the air like smoke. "Could be two prints together," Mason tried again. "Like somebody running, slipping." "You ever see someone with feet that big?" Doc asked quietly. Anthony didn't say anything. He just stared at the prints, at how deep they were. A man's weight might sink an inch into the mud. These were sunk nearly 3. Whatever walked here was heavy. "All right," Keller said at last, forcing authority into his tone. "We don't know what made them. Could be some kind of hoax. Could be some local superstition. Could be 1,000 damn things that have nothing to do with our job." He tore his gaze away and pointed at the tree line. "Hydrate, fill up, move out. We're not camping here. We'll make it to the hill spur marked Tango 3 before dark. That's the plan." No one argued. No one wanted to be near those footprints any longer than necessary. They moved faster after that, as if distance alone could outwalk whatever walked the stream. The jungle closed in overhead, turning the daylight into a perpetual dull twilight. Vines hung down like ropes. Thorny bushes grabbed at their uniforms, leaving thin scratches on their arms and faces. The air smelled more and more like something rotting that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to become. The radio started acting up in the afternoon. "Oscar 2, this is Recon Bravo." "Sitrep over," Keller said into the handset, pausing on a rock while the others caught their breath. All they got back was static. Not the usual hiss, but a thick, strangled sound like the radio was choking. Something high-pitched flickered in the background, almost like distant screaming run through a machine. "What the hell?" Doc muttered. Keller frowned and adjusted the antenna, shook it, checked the connections. "Oscar 2, repeat, this is Recon Bravo." "Sitrep, radio check, over." The same strangled static answered, and faintly under it something else. A voice, maybe, but garbled. Too fast, too jumbled, like several people whispering at once. Anthony felt sweat trickle down his spine. He'd heard radios pick up strange things before. Korean signals bouncing off the ionosphere. Stray frequencies from God knew where. But never anything that sounded like that. "Could be terrain," Doc offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Valley messing with the signal, maybe." "Yeah," Keller said slowly, "terrain." He clipped the handset back to his vest, but Anthony noticed the way his fingers lingered on it, reluctant to let go. By late afternoon, they reached Tango 3, a low hill rising out of the valley floor like a knuckle. The top was covered in scrub and a few stunted trees, but it offered better visibility than the claustrophobic jungle below. They set up a perimeter, dug shallow fighting positions, and tried again with the radio. This time they got something. "Bravo, say again. You're breaking terrain, repeat, Bravo, this is." The voice cut in and out, chewed by static. Keller pressed the handset hard against his ear. "This is Recon Bravo," he said. "We are at grid," he rattled off their coordinates. "No contact. Repeat, no contact, but radio's experiencing interference in." The line went dead mid-sentence. The sudden silence was worse than the garbled noise. Hello, Oscar 2, say again. Over. Nothing. Oscar 2, this is Recon Bravo, how copy? The handset hissed softly, then went quiet. Keller lowered it slowly. That's comforting, Mason said, trying for humor and failing. Maybe the ghost in the valley doesn't like radios. Anthony forced a laugh that sounded wrong in his own ears. The sun was dipping behind the ridgeline now, turning the sky a bruised purple. Long shadows spilled out from the scrub bushes, making the already sparse hilltop feel crowded with shapes. That night, nobody slept much. The air cooled a little, but the humidity clung to them like a second skin. They took turns on watch in pairs, Keller's orders. Nobody alone, he'd said. I don't care how tough you think you are, this place will chew at your head. Anthony's shift was the second. He sat with Tran, backs against a low rock, rifles across their laps. The jungle below the hill stretched out like a dark ocean, the trees swaying very slightly in a breeze he couldn't actually feel. Fireflies flickered in the undergrowth, tiny moving stars. For a while they didn't talk. Words felt slippery here. Finally, Anthony cleared his throat. What did that ARVN guy say, really? He asked softly. Back at base, the older one. Tran was quiet for a moment. He said the valley belongs to something that was here before the villages, he replied. Before the French, before anyone. You believe that? Tran's eyes reflected a faint gleam of starlight. In my village, we had an old tree. No one cut it, no matter how poor we were for firewood. My grandfather said the forest keeps count. When you take too much from it, it sends something to take back. Anthony shifted, uncomfortable. This valley just feels like bad ground, he muttered. Like it remembers things and doesn't want us here. Tran didn't answer. He was staring down the slope, his brow furrowing. What? Anthony whispered. There, Tran said. Do you see? Anthony followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Just the dense tangle of dark tree trunks and deeper shadows between them. Then, as his eyes adjusted, one of the shadows seemed to move. Not by much. Just a subtle shift, a small separation from the darkness around it. It was tall. For a second, only a second, Anthony saw an outline that his brain refused to understand. It stood between two trees, reaching nearly to the lowest branches. Too tall for a man. Its shoulders were wrong, too broad and hunched. There was no face to see, no clear features, only an absence of light where its head should be, as if it swallowed what little glow filtered down from the sky. It didn't move like a person. It didn't sway with the trees, it just stood there. Anthony blinked and it was gone, or maybe it had been gone all along. He didn't know. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his teeth. You saw that, right? He whispered, his voice shaking. Tran swallowed. Yes, he said quietly, I saw. They didn't wake the others. What would they say? That a shadow had looked at them, that the dark in the trees was taller for a second. They sat in silence for the rest of their shift, eyes burning, every muscle coiled. They weren't alone in the valley. Whether it was something living or not, whether it had flesh or was made of old stories and fear, it was there. The next day, Keller changed the plan. We're cutting the mission short, he said as they chewed tasteless rations under the colorless light of dawn. We've got radio issues and possible, unconventional factors. We have enough intel. We're heading back to the LZ for pickup. No argument here, Mason said immediately, relief evident in his voice. Doc looked worried. You think they'll actually send a bird in here? He asked. If the radios are fried, we might be on our own. They got a piece of our last transmission, Keller said. They know our general area, and if worst comes to worst, we walk out. I'm not keeping you in this valley any longer than necessary. Anthony wanted to thank him. Something about the way the air sat on his skin, heavy and almost oily, made him feel like the valley was slowly seeping into them, filling them up. They broke camp quickly and started moving. Down the hill, back into the close, suffocating embrace of the jungle. The path back wasn't really a path, just the faint memory of their previous trail and Tran's instincts. They passed landmarks that looked familiar. A moss-covered boulder like a sleeping buffalo, a twisted tree with roots that clawed at the air. And here and there, they saw signs that they weren't the only ones moving through this valley. A patch of earth disturbed, as if something heavy had knelt there. A tree trunk with bark scraped away far too high for any man to reach. A broken branch at head height, splintered like something had brushed past it with casual strength. No boot prints, no cigarette butts, no human trash. "This is like walking through somebody's living room," Doc muttered quietly during a brief stop. "Someone big and ugly." Anthony didn't respond. He'd noticed something else. The jungle was quieter today. Fewer bird calls. The insect drone seemed more distant, like someone had turned the volume down a notch. It felt like everything with any sense had moved away from their route. Around midday, it happened. They were crossing a shallow gully, the ground damp and soft underfoot, when Keller raised his hand for a halt. There was a slight rise ahead, choked with fallen branches. He signaled for Tran and Mason to flank left and right, eyes scanning. "Something's not right," Keller murmured. "I don't like." A long, slow creak from behind them, like something enormous shifting its weight on old wood. They spun, rifles up. Anthony's breath caught in his throat. At the edge of visibility, half hidden by lianas and leaves, something moved between the trees. Not a clear shape, not enough for his brain to lock onto, but a suggestion. A vertical mass, dark and tall, gliding rather than stepping. For a moment the canopy above seemed to dim, as if whatever it was drank in the light. "Jesus," Mason whispered. Keller's face went pale. "Back up," he said, voice low and steady. "Don't run, just back up, eyes on it." They stepped backward slowly, boots sinking into the wet ground. The shape remained where it was, watching. Anthony couldn't see eyes, but he felt them, a pressure on his skin like static. Then, somewhere off to the left, a branch snapped. Not near them, farther out. Another heavy footstep echoed faintly. There was more than one. "Move," Keller hissed. "Now." They broke into a controlled jog, discipline stretched to its limit. The jungle whipped at their faces. Anthony kept glancing over his shoulder, certain that if he looked away too long, something would be right there, reaching for him. Sometimes, when he looked back, he thought he saw it. A tall, dark outline sliding between trunks, always one or two layers of foliage deep, never fully visible. They didn't stop until they reached a patch of slightly higher ground where the trees thinned. Keller finally called a halt, bent over with his hands on his knees, sweat pouring down his face. "This is insane," Mason gasped. "What is that? What are those things?" Doc sat down hard on a fallen log, chest heaving. "Could be, I don't know, some kind of religious thing," he said, grasping at anything that made it less impossible. "Locals in costumes, ritual, trying to scare us off." Tran shook his head emphatically. "No costume moves like that," he said quietly. "No man is that tall." "Enough," Keller snapped, more harshly than he probably intended. "Doesn't matter what it is. It wants us gone. We're going. We keep our heads, we get out. That's it." He took a breath, tried the radio again. Static. Then briefly a voice. "Bravo, repeat extraction, 1700 LZ." The rest was swallowed by interference, but it was enough. "Did you hear that?" Keller said. "Extraction at 1700. We've got a time. We have to make it to the LZ by then." "What if those things don't want us to?" Mason asked. Keller's jaw tightened. "Then we make them want something else," he said grimly. "Let's move." The next hours blurred into a long stretch of tense, exhausting march. Every few minutes, one of them would swear they heard something behind them. A slow creak, a heavy step, the soft tearing of something large pushing through foliage. Whenever they stopped and listened, the jungle went quiet, as if holding its breath. At one point, Anthony realized he was counting his steps without meaning to, trying to match some rhythm he couldn't quite hear. He forced himself to stop, suddenly afraid that if he finished the count, something terrible would happen, like saying the last word of a curse. They reached the LZ clearing with 40 minutes to spare. It was a rough, makeshift landing zone hacked out of the jungle weeks before, a ragged oval of exposed dirt and trampled grass, ringed by tall trees. The sight of open sky was almost a shock. Keller signaled a perimeter and they fanned out, taking positions at the tree line. The silence was worse here. Usually, open spaces in the jungle were buzzing with life, birds darting in and out, insects humming. Here, there was almost nothing. Just the faint hiss of the wind high above and their own breathing. "Feels like a damn church," Doc muttered. "A church where somebody forgot to mention the altar is built of bones," Mason added, then immediately flinched at his own words. "Knock it off," Keller said. He checked his watch. "We hold here. When the bird comes in, we move fast. No heroics, no lagging. We're done with this place." Anthony's eyes kept drifting to the walls of trees. The jungle seemed to lean in, crowding the edge of the clearing, branches like fingers. Minutes crawled by. 10, 15, 20. "Shouldn't we be hearing it by now?" Doc asked quietly. "The chopper." "Well, maybe they're delayed," Keller said, but there was strain in his voice. Anthony scanned the sky. Nothing but a hazy blue-gray, smudged by distant smoke. No distant thump of rotors, no growing roar. And then from the trees behind them came a sound he would hear again in dreams for the rest of his life. It was a howl, but not like any animal he knew. It started low, a deep, vibrating moan that seemed to come from the earth itself, then rose higher and higher until it scraped at the inside of his skull. There was pain in it, anger, hunger. It echoed off the hills, bounced around the valley, leaving every nerve in his body screaming. "Contact, back line." Keller shouted instinctively, even though they couldn't see anything yet. Anthony whipped his rifle around toward the sound, fingers sliding to the trigger. The tree line in that direction was impenetrable shadow, the spaces between trunks suddenly blacker than night. Another howl answered the first, from the left, then a third from behind them. The clearing became a bowl of sound, the howls overlapping into a chorus of inhuman voices. "They're surrounding us," Mason whispered, panic creeping into his tone. "Hold your fire," Keller barked. "You don't shoot at shadows. We don't waste ammo unless we know what we're hitting." But Anthony's hands were already shaking. Something inside of him, some old animal part, was screaming, "Run, asterisk, asterisk." Every instinct, every survival reflex was telling him human weapons didn't belong in whatever was happening here. The radio crackled suddenly, loud and startling. Keller grabbed it like a lifeline. "Recon Bravo, this is Dustoff 1. We're coming in hot. I'm not seeing your smoke. Do you copy? Over." Keller nearly shouted into the handset. "Dustoff 1, this is Recon Bravo. We're at the LZ. You're clear to approach." "No smoke, repeat, no smoke. We're under possible fire from unknown hostiles. We need immediate extraction." "Copy that, Bravo," the pilot's voice crackled. "We've got about 5 minutes before this weather closes in. You boys better be ready to run. Over." 5 minutes, Keller repeated, looking at the others. "We just have to hold for 5 minutes." 5 minutes suddenly felt like a year. The howls continued, but they changed. They grew closer, less echo, more direct. The sound no longer felt like it came from the valley, it came from the trees, from just out of sight. Then something stepped to the edge of the clearing. It wasn't fully visible. It was as if the shadows themselves thickened and rose, pulling away from the trunks to form a rough, towering outline. 10 feet tall if it was an inch. Broad shoulders hunched, arms too long. The space where its head should have been was just wrong. A smudge that refused to resolve into features. Anthony's mind tried to reject it. His eyes slid off the outline like oil on water. Every time he thought he caught a detail, an angle, a curve, it shifted, slipping away. The air around it grew colder. His breath fogged in front of him, a ridiculous thing in the tropical humidity. He realized his rifle was shaking. He tightened his grip, tried to aim center mass, but there was no center to lock onto. Back to the center," Keller shouted. "Circle up." They formed a loose ring, shoulder to shoulder, rifles pointed outward. Anthony took a position half facing the thing at the tree line, half aware of motion in his peripheral vision, other tall shapes lingering between other trees, surrounding the clearing. "Dustoff 1, how far out are you?" Keller demanded into the radio. 2 minutes, came the reply. I repeat, 2M, wait, what the hell is that? Is that smoke on the ridge? Bravo, are you popping smoke? The radio screeched, a high piercing sound that went straight through Anthony's eardrums. He winced, nearly dropping it, but Keller clung to the handset like a lifeline. Dust off 1, say again, over. No answer, just that same strangled static from before, like the valley itself was chewing up the signal. The thing at the tree line stepped forward. The ground seemed to dip under its weight, though Anthony saw no footprints. It moved in a slow, fluid motion, sliding rather than striding. As it crossed fully into the edge of the clearing, the light around it dimmed, as if it carried its own darkness. Stop, Keller shouted, voice cracking. I don't know if you can understand me, but stop. We're leaving, we're going. This doesn't have to be. The howl that answered him cut him off, a blast of sound that made Anthony's vision blur. He felt something in his nose pop. When he wiped his upper lip, his fingers came away with blood. And still, no chopper. The others opened fire. It started with Mason. Maybe he snapped. Maybe he just couldn't hold back anymore. He screamed, a raw, panic sound, and unloaded his rifle at the tall shape, tracers streaking through the dim light. The bullets passed through it. Anthony saw them, the faint trails of disturbance in the air, the splinters flying from the trees behind the figure. But the thing itself didn't react. It didn't jerk or flinch. It just kept coming, slow and steady. Cease fire, Keller bellowed, grabbing Mason's arm. You're just wasting. Something moved behind them. Anthony spun. Another of the tall figures was at the opposite edge of the clearing now, closer than the first. 10 feet tall, maybe more, hunched and wrong. The shadows beneath it were thicker, like a pool. Doc Harris whimpered, actually whimpered like a frightened child. We're dead, he breathed. We're dead, we're dead. Stop it. Anthony snapped, anger cutting through his fear. We're not dead yet. As if in answer, a new sound cut through the howls, the distant, blessed thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors. Dust off 1. Keller shouted into the radio. We see you. We're at the clearing, come straight in. The rotor noise grew louder. Anthony looked up and saw it, a dark shape against the sky, wobbling slightly in the valley's erratic air currents. The sound was rough, as if the chopper was fighting resistance that was more than just wind. Move, Keller yelled. When that bird's 30 meters out, we run for it. We don't stop, we don't look back. The tall figures kept advancing. Though they moved slowly, the distance between them and the squad seemed to shrink too fast, as if space itself was bending. The air grew thick, hard to breathe. Anthony's ears rang with a mix of howls and rotor thumps. 30 meters. Go, go, go. Keller shouted as the chopper dropped lower, its downdraft whipping up dust and leaves. They ran. Anthony sprinted toward the center of the clearing, eyes locked on the helicopter, trying not to look left or right. He heard footfalls beside him, Mason, Doc, Tran, Keller, boots slamming into the dirt. The rotor wash hit him like a wall, nearly knocking him sideways. Behind them, the howls intensified. They rose and twisted, becoming almost words, syllables in a language he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Something brushed against his back as he ran, cold and heavy, like a wet curtain. He stumbled, feeling his heart slam against his ribs, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. Looking back would mean stopping, and stopping would mean. Tran screamed. It was a high, strangled sound, cut off abruptly. Anthony's body kept moving, but his mind jerked, wanting to turn to help to understand. Just run, Keller roared. Don't you look back, that's an order. Anthony's throat burned. He felt tears in his eyes from the wind, from the cold, from the knowledge that Tran, quiet, steady Tran, was no longer beside him. They reached the chopper like a wave breaking. Hands reached out from the open door, grabbing straps, pulling them in. Anthony slammed against the interior, scrambled to turn around, to grab Mason's arm, to drag him up. Mason wasn't there. It was just Doc, eyes wild, and Keller, hauling himself in with a final, desperate pull. The door gunner shouted something he couldn't hear, voice lost in the roar. Where, Anthony started, but the words died as Keller leaned out, eyes scanning the clearing below. For a split second, Anthony saw it too. At the edge of the clearing, where they'd been only moments ago, one of the tall figures loomed over something struggling on the ground. The outline of its arm extended, impossibly long, and then the struggling stopped. The chopper lurched upward. The clearing dropped away, the trees rising to meet them, then falling as they gained altitude. The howls followed them for a moment, echoing up from the valley, then faded into a ringing silence. Anthony collapsed against the metal wall, chest heaving, vision tunneling. Doc sat opposite him, staring at nothing, lips moving without sound. Keller still knelt by the open door, hands gripping the frame so hard his knuckles were white. When he finally pulled himself inside and the door slid shut, the sudden relative quiet inside the helicopter felt unreal, like the inside of a dream. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "Bravo, this is Dust-Off 1. We're clear of the valley. You boys got some interesting weather down there, damn near chewed the rotors off. Everyone accounted for." Nobody answered. "Bravo, you copy, everyone accounted for." Keller closed his eyes. "This is Sergeant Keller," he said quietly. "We have casualties, 2 missing in action, last seen in the LZ clearing." "Copy that," the pilot said, tone sobering. "We'll report it." The rest of the flight passed in a stunned silence. Back at base, under the washed-out sun and the smell of fuel and disinfectant, it was easy to pretend it hadn't been real. The valley seemed like a fever dream. The tall shadows, the howls, the radio that sounded like it was picking up the dying breaths of old gods. Reports were filed. There were questions, debriefings, forms. The official record stated that Privates Mason and Tran went missing during an extraction under hostile conditions, presumed captured or KIA by enemy forces. The mention of unknown tall silhouettes and impossible footprints was quietly removed somewhere along the chain of command. "Valley's bad ground," one of the intelligence guys told Keller, almost kindly. "Whole area's got a reputation. You boys were in there longer than recommended. Lack of sleep, stress. Auditory and visual hallucinations aren't uncommon in those conditions." Anthony sat outside the tent, listening to that through the thin canvas, staring at his hands. The thin scratches from the jungle were already scabbing over. The bruises on his shoulders from the recoil of a rifle that hadn't hit anything were fading. The memory of the tall figure at the tree line did not fade. Sometimes at night, he'd wake up in his bunk convinced he could feel a weight near his bed, something tall and patient, watching him in the darkness. Whenever they flew over jungle after that, he'd find his eyes searching for any sign of a clearing ringed by trees, a small, wrong patch of land in the endless green. He never saw Valley 47B again, but once, weeks later, he heard something. They were on another mission, another part of the country entirely. Different unit, different map, same heat, same smell of rain and old smoke. The radio crackled with routine chatter, coordinates and call signs. Then, just for a second, something slipped in under the static. A low, distant howl, stretched thin by distance and interference. It rose and fell in a pattern that made his skin crawl. Nobody else reacted. No one flinched. The lieutenant kept talking like nothing had happened. Anthony reached up, turned down the volume on his radio and stared into the trees. The jungle stared back. Years later, long after the war, after he'd traded his rifle for a quieter life in a place where the air didn't always smell like fear, he still dreamed of that valley. In his dreams, he walked the narrow stream again, retraced his steps to the patch of mud where the footprints had been. Sometimes, the mud was smooth, undisturbed, and he'd wake up with tears on his face and no idea why. Other times, the prints were there, long, deep, impossibly spaced. On the worst nights, the mud was full of them, not just one line of footprints, but many, crossing and overlapping, circling, coming together at the clearing like a gathering of something that had been waiting a very long time. In those dreams, he always ended up back in the LZ, standing alone in the center of the clearing. There was no chopper overhead, no comrades beside him, just the trees leaning close. The tall shadows at the edges, stepping forward, slow and inevitable. He would hold his breath, hoping to wake up before they reached him. Sometimes he did. Sometimes, just as the nearest one began to bend down toward him, as the air grew so cold his breath turned to ice, he would hear a faint, distant sound from above. The thump of rotors struggling through thick, heavy air, and a voice, thin and crackling, drifting down from a radio that wasn't really there anymore. "Bravo, this is Dust-Off 1, we're coming in hot. Hold your position." He'd wake then, heart in his throat, hands clenching the sheets like a rifle. On the nights when he didn't hear that voice, when there was only the howling and the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer, he would lie awake for hours, staring into the dark, listening for any creak of the house settling that sounded a little too much like a 10-foot-tall thing shifting its weight on old wood. He never went into forests again. Even a line of trees at the edge of a field could make his chest tighten, his palms start to sweat. His family thought it was just the war, and it was, in a way. The war had left many shadows in him, but there was one shadow that was not content to stay inside. Sometimes, standing at his back door at night, looking out at the modest row of trees the neighbors had planted years ago, he would think he saw something move between them. Just a suggestion of height, a hint of darkness where there should be only leaves. He'd blink and it would be gone. The last time he dreamed of the valley, he was old. His body was weaker, his breath shorter, but in the dream he was young again, boots sinking into Vietnam mud, rifle heavy in his hands. The jungle smelled the same. Wet earth, rot, the ghost of old fires. He walked to the stream, to the patch of mud. There were no footprints this time. Instead, there was a single sentence scratched into the wet earth, letters rough and uneven, as if written by a trembling hand. "We were here first." He woke up with the distant echo of howls in his ears and the feeling, just for a moment, that something very tall had been standing beside his bed, watching him sleep, patient as the forest. When his family found him the next morning, his face was peaceful. His hands were folded on his chest, fingers slightly stained with a faint, dried brown, like old mud. They never knew why one of his last notebooks, tucked away in a drawer, had a single page filled over and over with the same line, written in a shaking hand. "The forest keeps count." He never spoke about Valley 47B after the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to the therapists who gently nudged at his memories. Officially, it was just another lost patrol, another ambiguous entry in the endless list of classified operations. But sometimes, when the wind moved through the trees in a certain way, when the radio between police cars or construction crews crackled with static as it passed by some stretch of woodland, someone near him might see him flinch, just a little. His eyes would flick to the tree line, just for a second, like he expected to see something 10 feet tall and impossibly old waiting there. Because somewhere, in a valley on the far side of the world that didn't exist on any map, something had watched 5 soldiers walk through its living room. It had stepped closer, listened to their heartbeat, tasted the metal of their fear. It had let 3 go. The forest keeps count, and sometimes when the numbers don't balance, it remembers.